Okay, today I'm going to be talking about an intervention called repeated reading and its context within the science of reading. I really want to talk about this because I've been getting a lot of questions and comments about it lately. Um, Repeated reading is a really simple idea. It's the idea you take a text like a short story or a poem or a paragraph, and you have your student or students read it multiple times in a row to try and build their oral fluency skills, the ability to read quickly and accurately. Um, Today, I'm going to be looking at this through the lens of a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is studies of studies, and it's really important to look at scientific research and education through this lens because we tend to have a lot of variability in education research. So you might have one study showing a negative result and one study showing a really high result. So you can't just pick one individual study. You have to look at what do most studies show? What is the norm? And that's what a meta-analysis does. Usually they do this through something called an effect size. An effect size is like a standardized percentage, not exactly, but you kind of interpret that way. Anything above zero point 0.4 is considered above average, and anything above 0.8 is considered really, really good. These are the meta-analyses that have been done on repeated reading, and as you can see, they all show fairly sizable outcomes. Now, one of the things that comes up as a criticism of this research is often, well, did they show an improvement because they read like the same text and then you assess them on that text, or because they read a new text? And generally speaking, in the research, we call this a cold reading versus a hot reading. So hot reading is where I give a student a poem, I say have them read it 3 times, and then I test them on their fluency on reading that poem. Personally, and I think most people would agree, this is not a very reliable or meaningful assessment. A cold reading is where we give them a new reading to see if that transferred or if the skill transferred over to the new text. And this is seen as a much more reliable metric and it's more meaningful, right? We don't want to know if we can improve students' ability to read one single text. We want to know if we can improve their ability to read in general. There are 2 meta-analyses that looked at this specifically. Specifically, the Yoon et al. Meta-analyses in 2017 looked at passage transfer, as they refer to it, and they found a mean effect size in the literature of 0.97. So that's really high. That's actually almost double the impact, or actually, I should say, it's more than double the average impact of phonics across phonics studies. And I think most people in the science of reading community would recognize that phonics is an evidence-based strategy. And this one is all of the theory meta-analysis done in 2004. And this is just the results for passage transfer. And we see a mean effect size of 0.58 in their analysis. So not quite as high as the Yoon one, but still higher than the average found for phonics across the literature. So I think it's actually fairly safe to say that repeated reading is just as evidence-based as phonics, if not more. So the next question that comes up is, well, when do we use repeated reading? Well, repeated reading is a fluency intervention. So in order to use it, students need to be able to read a little bit. It doesn't really make sense to do repeated reading interventions with students who don't know like their very basic phoneme grapheme correspondences. But generally speaking, we see high outcomes for repeated reading across all grades, whether it's elementary or secondary. So there's not really a grade where it's super inappropriate to do a repeated reading. Personally, I've spent a lot of time teaching like upper high school, and I wouldn't really want to do repeated reading in upper high school because it just doesn't seem relevant to where you want them to go next. And like I said, I wouldn't do it in like a pre-K class because they're still learning their basic letters and alphabet sounds and names. But that said, I think you can do repeated reading quite early because once students know even a handful of sounds, we could use repeated reading within a logical context to help improve that phonics knowledge. So for example, let's say you start off your students on the sat pin sounds, which is a very normal way to start students off on their phonics instruction. You start them off a small number of sounds, and then you have decodable readers that go with it. If you're in that situation where you're teaching a very specific set of phoneme grapheme correspondences, and you have decodables with it, I think it makes total sense to include some repeated readings of those decodable readers. Now, this isn't me saying this based off of the research. This is just a logical extrapolation. But we know because that fluency interventions work at quite early age. As soon as we can read a couple words, or we have texts that allow them to read a couple words, it makes total sense to include repeated reading. Now, once students know their phoneme grapheme correspondences, or at least most of them, personally, because generally speaking, you use repeated reading as sort of a guided practice where the teacher reads the text first. I would try to gravitate more towards authentic texts, because then you can build in some comprehension with your fluency instruction, and you can ask students questions about that text. And that doesn't really work well with, say, a decodable reader. One thing that I will throw out there that's really important for repeated reading is the number of repeats to do. There's actually some debate over this. There was some research showing that like 3 or 4 repeats was really good, but actually we see the highest outcome for repeated reading when we have the students read till mastery. And that's actually something common across education in general. Having students repeat a task until they've mastered it before moving on to something else is something that, generally speaking, shows really high outcomes. So if a student shows that they can read the text fluently on your second reading, there's no need to do a third one. The third repeated reading is an arbitrary number. And the same is if, the students read that a third time and they're still struggling, it might be time to do a fourth or even a fifth reading. Generally speaking, repeated reading can be a little bit of a boring activity. So personally, I wouldn't advocate for doing more than 5-10 minutes in a class. I would say 10 minutes is probably the upper limit. And it can be used for a variety of things. I don't think it needs to be done as like one thing. It can be done with short stories. It can be done with poems. Poems are great because they have a sort of natural rhythm. And because we're trying to build those oral fluency skills, having them read things with a natural rhythm makes total sense. Or having them read sort of authentic texts where there's going to be deep comprehension elements can be great, because then you can build in that comprehension piece. Or you can even build it into other lessons with like content knowledge. So let's say you're teaching a history lesson and you really want them to remember something. You can pause on an important text and do that repeated reading with the important text. There isn't really a right or a wrong way, in my opinion, personally, of which text to use or how to use it. But I think the important part is that you're including it as part of your instructional routines, as it is one of the more evidence-based approaches. Personally, I think it makes the most sense to use in that grade 3 to 6 range. And that's not to say you shouldn't use it before or after. I think it's just that's the age range where we're going to get the most bang for our buck, so to speak. It's when students probably know their phoneme grapheme correspondences, their phonics, but they might not be reading with automaticity yet. And that's, in my opinion, the real purpose of repeated reading. It's to help students develop the ability to read with automaticity. And then once students are reading with automaticity in general, I think a lot of students by grade 8, grade 7 are reading with automaticity. You might want to be using less of this approach. And that's not to say that you should never use it, because the research shows it works in high school. But I think it might be a little more class dependent, or it might be something you use a little less often. That's it for now, folks. And until next time.